Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Philosophy of Health. This is your host, Miok. Today we're continuing on what has turned out to be a 4-part series on the history of philosophy. And I just want to say a few words so that you guys can follow our conversation a little bit more easily, because he's written this book and I've read it, and so we kind of know the players, and in the conversation we sort of just get right into it. So I want to catch you guys up so that we can all start on the same page. So we mentioned a couple of names in this podcast. We talk about a guy named Fichte, who was very influential in the 18th century. And all you really need to know about him for this episode is that he influenced a guy named Schlegel, who we go into. And Schlegel, in one of his many iterations of remaking himself, decides that Fichte sucks. But Locke, John Locke, was a philosopher who was very involved in shaping what we know today as capitalism. He was very interested in the idea of private property. He was also a physician, and there's actually an episode prior to this on autoimmunity, because John Locke took the idea of private property, namely the body, and then he took this legal definition of immunity, of like diplomatic legal immunity, which goes back to the Roman Empire. And he began to see the body for the first time as not something to be balanced with nature, but something to be defended against nature. And from that, this legal term becomes a medical term, and we have now our concept of the autoimmune system. So John Locke was a fucker, and he is also someone that is praised by a guy named Desjardins, who we will be discussing. Now, we're talking about Desjardins, and we're talking about Schlegel in this podcast, because these are two men who approached the history of philosophy with a similar form. They were interested not in setting forth like, okay, so this person is the end-all, be-all of philosophy, so now that we know what philosophy is, we can write the history of philosophy according to that person. What they did was they just said, hey, look, okay, let's look at all of these different philosophical systems and take them in and of themselves and compare them to each other, just like they do in science and just like we do in literature now, the way we do with languages. Let's do it with philosophy. So this was a way of looking at the history of philosophy in a way that was not Kantian. But they were very different because Desjardins was racist, and he did actually kind of supplant John Locke in the place of Kant. So his philosophy in the end was kind of serving this agenda because he was a super politically conservative dude. And so basically what Peter Park and I are doing is exactly what the Kantians didn't want people to do. We are looking at people's biographies and looking at how it shaped their thinking, which is something we do with every other discipline. It just is weird that we wouldn't do this in philosophy. You know, when we look at politicians, we like to know about their lives because it shows us how it shapes their political views and why they would respond to a certain version of history, right? So like when we see a family values Republican, you know, it's helpful to know that Strom Thurmond had a secret black child, you know, this super racist guy, had a black kid, never told anybody. That's important to know. It gives us insight into his politics. So this is kind of what we do. It's certainly not as sensational with these philosophers, although it can be. I mean, Kant certainly had some weird shit going on that I'll probably talk about in the next podcast. But this is all a reaction to Kant because Kant is such a big figure. And I was thinking that people wanted to say that he was doing something completely new, but really he was just taking a lot of old systems and putting them together in a new way. And I would describe him as the Walmart supercenter of philosophy. Like, there had been garden stores before, There were gun stores, there were grocery stores before, but he housed them all under one roof so that you could buy your dinner and your machine gun and a nice flower so that you could eat, kill someone, and give them a proper burial, all in one place. So that's how huge Kant was. Another word that we throw around is Ionian. We talk about the Ionian philosophers, which probably you've never heard of. Ionians were some dudes who lived in Italy, right? Because according to, the real philosophy started in Greece, right? Started with Plato, but actually the pre-Socratics, that is the people who practiced philosophy before Socrates, some of them were considered to be Ionian, and they were living in Italy across the sea from Greece. And so we talk about the Ionians. They're very rudimentary. They're sort of natural scientists. We think that some guy named Thales is a genius because he could draw a triangle and go, ooh. So you can keep that in mind as we are talking about them. Because basically we're saying that you can give these guys credit for coming up with their own ideas because the ideas look like they're kind of like coming out of nowhere, out of no complex tradition. But when you look at guys like Pythagoras, who is the guy we get the Pythagorean theorem from, who was very, very interesting guy. I mean, his ideas were all about transmigration of the soul and the music of the spheres. Like he was a really intense mystic. And when you look at Pythagoras and then when you look at Plato, it's like, it really does seem like they came out of nowhere in many ways because their ideas were not found anywhere in Greece. And it's sort of interesting when we look through history that we tend to think of the exceptions to cultures and to nations as being representative of them, when really, in many cases, it's like Plato was almost exiled, Socrates was murdered, Aristotle was exiled, and yet we think of them as the most Greek that you can possibly get, when really they were, at their own time, kind of the rejects, right? So the reason that we remember them is actually because they kind of weren't Greek at all. And that's definitely something important to note in context of what we're talking about, which is like unseating fucking history. There's a saying that goes, whoever tells the story creates the world. And I think that it's pretty clear now that history has been written by a bunch of psychos. And actually, Alexander Herzen wrote, history is the autobiography of a madman. And so, in a way, this is kind of what we're discussing, is a bit of that. Desjardins and Schlegel, even though they are both interested in comparative philosophy, they're very, very different because, as I mentioned, Desjardins is conservative and Schlegel isn't. At least his early attitudes aren't. And I think especially when we compare Schlegel to the Kantians, we see exactly how important dominating versions of history are. Because on the one hand, you have the Kantians who are saying everything sucked and everything's getting better. Whereas Schlegel, who became Catholic, really thought that everything was better at an earlier time. And that philosophy began, that humans began thinking not out of this really crappy, savage place, but that we were actually in a place where we were in divine revelation, where we just knew. And when we separated from that knowledge, we had to start fucking thinking. And now we've gone so far to thinking ourselves into this mega complex that's so complicated that no single person can grasp the whole thing, that philosophy's actually been recording the fall of man. And so, depending on where you think history starts and how you think it starts is extremely, extremely important. And that's what's really going on in our world today, is that we're at war because what is at stake are competing versions of history. There are people who think that the Native Americans had this land, that the land of the earth belongs to indigenous people, that they are the water protectors, that they are the proper stewards of the land. And then there are people who believe that the best thing that ever happened to them was white people, and that they should be, kissing the rings on their fingers because they have electricity and the Super Bowl. So this is the current clash. This is the clash of modernity with the ancient world. That's what we're experiencing right now. There are people with eternal beliefs, and there are people with progressive beliefs, and not progressive politically, not progressive liberal, but progressive in the sense that they think that we are actually making progress. So all this is something to keep in mind as Peter Park and I continue our series and discuss what could have been and what can still be. So thanks for tuning in, and see you next time. So today we're going to talk about 4 different schools of thinking about the history of philosophy that were happening at the same time that the Kantians were thinking about it. Or actually, we're going to be talking about the generation after as well. So what was happening in this general time period of the Enlightenment. We're going to talk a little bit about the competing versions of the history of philosophy that were going on that didn't win out, that people don't know about today. There were things going on in France. There were also some interesting things going on in Germany. And so I thought actually that it might be interesting to talk about 2 men who were trying to do something similar, but in their different ways, and they ended up in different places. But there's one man named de Girondeau, who was a Frenchman, who was trying to do a comparative philosophy. And then there was also a man named Schlegel, who was engaged in a similar project in the sense that it was nothing like what the Kantians were doing. So I thought we could take those guys one at a time and try to talk about what their vision of philosophy was, or the history of philosophy was, and by extension, the history of mankind, certainly the history of Western civilization, to give people a kind of idea of what could have been. We ended up with Kant's version of history, but these are alternate sort of views of history that are very legitimate, done by highly qualified historians of a different era. Yeah, so let's start with de Girondeau. Can you tell us a bit about who he was and what his history of philosophy was like?
My pleasure. Joseph-Marie de Girondeau was born in Lyon in France in 1772, if I remember that correctly. And he was preparing to enter the priesthood when the French Revolution broke out. And during that revolution, he fought on the counter-revolutionary side. Well, the counter-revolutionaries were defeated. He was imprisoned. He was headed for the guillotine, but managed to escape and flee to Alsace. In Alsace, he stayed more than a year, and during that time, learned German and read in German philosophy. When Napoleon took over the revolution, de Girondeau was hired into Napoleon's government. De Girondeau also had a professorial chair, I think at one of the Paris schools of higher education. His title was Professor of Moral Philosophy, and de Girondeau wrote, besides writing in moral philosophy, he wrote a work in the theory of knowledge, taking up questions concerning the theory of knowledge from his contemporary times. Many philosophers were working on the theory of knowledge on either side of the Rhine, and also, obviously, Britain and elsewhere in Europe. And he also wrote a large work, A Comparative History of Philosophy, published in 1804. And this history of philosophy is unique. It is, as I argue in my book, the first instance of a comparative history of philosophy. So de Girondeau had to conceive of such an approach, a comparative approach. Now, he did not have to look far to find the idea for it. because in Paris, an exciting development was in zoology and other life sciences, specifically the development of the new sciences of comparative anatomy and comparative physiology. So the comparative method was having a birth in the sciences, and he took this method and applied it to philosophy and the history of philosophy.
He even called it the experimental method.
Yes, because he saw that comparative analysis of observations made of phenomena was a successful method in the sciences, and it should be. The sciences characterized as experimental, science based on experiment and observation, so that's what he meant by the experimental method, but that this should be a useful method in the field of philosophy as well. And I argue that he's the first to make this bridge or crossover of some methodological principles in natural science or in the life science and bringing it over to philosophy. This comparative history of philosophy is quite good. It's just, it's in French. Most of it is not translated, but it is a pleasure to read in French. He's very knowledgeable. He's deeply read in all ancient and modern, also medieval schools of philosophy and philosophers. So the kind of knowledge that any historian of philosophy should have who embarks on writing a history of philosophy. And he organized all the different philosophers and their schools into classes of philosophy. And he named them idealism, realism, dogmatism, skepticism, materialism, and for the new philosophy that he saw coming out of Germany, he created a separate class for this new philosophy, calling it Kantianism. That he took all past systems of philosophy and identified them and ordered them into these classes makes him similar to the natural historians and the taxonomists of the 18th century and his contemporary times, Linnaeus, Georges, Leclerc, Buffon, to name just a few or a couple. He was doing for the history of philosophy what naturalists were doing for the history of nature. And why he was doing that was to know the history of philosophy that much better and to know the history of philosophy thoroughly. All the parts of the systems of philosophy, how they're related to other systems of philosophy, the successes and failures of these individual systems of philosophy, and the motivation of the philosophers who created systems, and to organize all past systems into these classes or groupings so that he could make some general but powerful observations about what was good in practical terms of certain systems versus what was not so useful, not so good in practical terms. And he concluded that an eclectic, Lockean, experimental philosophy was the most successful, held the greatest promise for the needs of society and also the needs of government. So John Locke becomes his model for philosophy, for a successful philosophy. Also grouped in with John Locke is Francis Bacon, and he saw many early modern and contemporary philosophers fitting into this Lockean school. He called it the experimental philosophy. The way to explain this other naming of the Lockean school is that he saw John Locke's philosophy as taking a lot from natural science. John Locke's philosophy is already an experimental philosophy. But experimental philosophy doesn't begin and end with John Locke, because there is also Francis Bacon, okay, and there is Isaac Newton. And he listed all the philosophers, and some of them you would identify as scientists, that he considered part of the experimental school. And so he promoted this school of philosophy. He also had I believe, devastating critique of Kantian philosophy, The other schools, such as the materialist schools and the idealist schools and the schools of various dogmatic philosophies, those he treated in the sense of quickly dispatching as not so successful, relatively swiftly compared to Kant's philosophy, which he treated to an extended critical discussion. Now, in the previous session I had with you, we talked about Kant and Kantianism. So I would like to say some words about what Desjardins thought about Kant's philosophy. He thought that Kant's philosophy was yet another eclecticism, like John Locke's philosophy and a lot of modern philosophers, and that Kant's philosophy was a little bit of Aristotelian logic. It was combined with Platonic moral theory. There was a part of Kant's philosophy which was skepticism, and a part that was also derived from experimental philosophy. There is still the Leibnizian philosophy in the Kantian philosophy in terms of the goals that are set out for philosophy. He shared the goals of philosophy with those of Leibniz. So it is an eclecticism, right? Meaning just a combination of the parts of previous systems. And in this way, Kant's philosophy on the level of its parts is nothing new, but the combination is new. And he put Kantian philosophy in its own class, but I think he might have done this ironically, okay? Or he had a kind of double meaning by doing this, right? In other words, it could be seen as like not even deserving of its own classification because it's such a eclectic mix of these other schools, which are older than Kant and have a long history, these other schools. But the combination is new. And also Kant's philosophy there was such an enthusiasm for Kant's philosophy, okay, with so many adherents thinking that it was a new moment, a new school of philosophy, a new system that maybe as an appeasement or maybe as a way of addressing those enthusiasts for Kant, Desjardins put Kant's philosophy in its own class. But, as I believe, what he showed was that Kant's philosophy was repeating the parts of previous systems, including some ancient ones and including some modern ones.
It's kind of ironic because we see the spirit of the natural sciences during this time permeating the thought of everyone, that you've got Kant trying to scientifically classify people according to race, and now you have Desjardins trying to classify systems of philosophy in a very similar way. And yet, in this way, Kant is sort of becoming a mutt. He's kind of a super mutt of all the past systems of thought. But really, he's the old stuff done in a new way.
Yes. His followers regarded his philosophy as not old stuff at all, but as a refutation of those old beliefs, right? Those old, what we say, dogmas, I guess, to be a bit more formal or technical. They saw Kant's philosophy as something just brand spanking new. And in the last session I had with you, you talked about Kantians being good marketers of Kant's philosophy. Well, that holds here. They were good marketers, and what they marketed was that Kant's philosophy was the refutation, right? It was a system of philosophy that defeated all previous systems, that it was the definitive system of philosophy, that there was now this complete break from past philosophy, and that Kant's philosophy is like the end of philosophy, which is something else you mentioned in our previous session.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the great pitfall, I think, of every generation is they don't realize they're just seeing all this shit for the first time, but that it's actually old, that there's nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, I remember thinking that it was unprecedented when I sort of awakened with my political consciousness and saw the Bush-Gore fallout. And I thought, wow, this has never happened before. Like, this is just, but then you see it, you go through history and you realize that it was sort of just old hat. But I like what Desjardins was doing when he was classifying these systems of philosophy, the way he was organizing history. Because instead of doing what the Kantians did, which was sort of start with how they think it should end and then have everything sort of make sense to lead up to that point, he seems to be suspending judgment or, any sort of preconceived notions and trying just to look at each system of philosophy just by its own merits without imposing any sort of contemporary standards or any sort of personal bias or, whatever you want to call it. And in that way, it seems like it was very much in the spirit of science, of this attempt at least to be objective, even if he was maybe just supplanting Kant in favor of John Locke.
Yeah. He is definitely more unbiased and has a more scientific attitude towards the questions of philosophy.
Well, and political, because he's a political guy, so he's not just interested in playing around with all of these ideas that we'll never know if they work or not. He's really interested in the practical effects of what do these ideas mean, how do they apply to the real world, how do they apply to science and art and government and so forth.
Yes. And therefore he's doing all this practical work better than the Kantians are. So his approach to investigating the history of philosophy is more neutral. He does a better job of not favoring Kantianism in his account. I think he favors John Locke and the so-called experimental school of philosophy. But relative to the Kantians, he definitely could be seen as more scientific, neutral, unbiased, objective. Any of those terms would hold in a comparison with how the Kantians write the history of philosophy and how they organize it, with Kant's philosophy being the end point, and also Kant's philosophy being, in fact, the one that they derive the definition and the concepts of what philosophy is, which then enables them to exclude all these other philosophies, right, or schools as not philosophy, right? So these are all a bunch of exclusions that Desjardins can't be accused of committing.
So just to talk a little bit about his critique, because he was a science guy, he was very much into the empirical world. And so what was his critique specifically of what we call speculative philosophy, or what he called speculative philosophy, just the life of the mind, of playing with these very abstract concepts that can really only play amongst themselves? Like, what was his problem with that?
Speculative philosophy, and his example is Fichte's philosophy, it is Schelling, and Kant's own philosophy in part. And his examples are also those ancient speculative philosophers. The Eleatics is one example. And his critique is that speculative philosophy is a construction and a will to construct out of the bare innate knowledge that human beings possess before and apart from experience.
So it's essentially just denying one's experience.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. As a part of this project, yeah.
Which is an extension of wanting to deny the biography of philosophers as well. Like, let's not just deny our experience, let's deny others' experience, but let's deny the entire realm of experience in general, all of empirical data.
Yeah, and culture and religion, right? And the passions, including moral feelings or aesthetic affects.
So basically everything that makes us human.
Yes, except for those small bits of knowledge that speculative philosophers believe that humans hold or have access to apart from experience. And the example of this would be mathematical knowledge. And another example of this kind of knowledge would be some logical principles, like the one that Desjardins uses as an example is A equals A. So, and that would be the law of non-contradiction. Well, if I should put it in the terms of the law of non-contradiction, I should say A plus is not A minus or something like that. So based on something like the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction, Desjardins was explicit that really these two principles are the same. There are two sides of one principle. That this principle is used by speculative philosophers, and he had contemporary German philosophers in mind, but also past philosophers could be held up as examples, that their impulse is to derive other knowledge from something so meager, something that really is not knowledge, but as Aristotle called it, an organon, an instrument of knowledge or for knowledge. And that what they constructed out of mere logical principles, okay, were constructs that had all these parts and did something for the philosopher author of such a construct, but did not have any practical benefit, okay, did not really address morality. And to the extent that some philosophers thought that speculation could address moral questions, he thought that this was a pernicious impulse or move. And so he thought that speculative philosophy was empty of content. His example is Fichte. His other example is Schelling, but Schelling comes out of this project a little better than Fichte because Schelling combines speculation with actually a whole set of knowledge principles from natural science. Okay, and so Schelling supplements speculation with something that is more grounded in the study of nature. So this foundationalism, and Fichte would be, again, the best example, one of the best examples of foundationalism, is the feature of speculative philosophy and one that Desjardins critiqued as not having a practical benefit. And of course, to that criticism, it's really hard to have an answer to his criticism on that.
Yeah, the problem with speculative philosophy, from what I read in your book, is basically that the mind travels in a circle. And it's just this self-referential thing, like someone talking about a video game. And then feeling really good that you beat it, but you really just beat this thing that only exists in and of itself and has no basis in the real world.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit more dangerous, or at least idealism is more dangerous in the sense that you just don't have access to reality anymore. Like your mind or the self creates nature while at the same time separating you from it. And like you said, and also your sentiments and your emotions. But it's a very dangerous thing to give the mind the status of being the author of existence, rather than recognizing existence in and of itself for what it is. And I think one of Desjardins' critiques of Kantianism was that Kant really loves to flatter this part of us, really likes to flatter the mind. He thinks so highly of it, he gives it so much authority and really kind of all the credit. But Kant did do some good things, according to Desjardins. He really exposed a lot of the problems with previous systems, as you noted, that are part of his philosophy. He also identified some of the core issues that philosophy has been grappling with throughout its history. But Kant also there was no mission accomplished at the end of it. And that's what Kantians herald themselves on, is they were like, hey, we did it. It's like the end. We don't have to think anymore. We figured it all out. But Desjardins is saying, no, you didn't really. And so with his comparative history of philosophy, he does some very interesting things because he avoids some of the pitfalls of Kant's approach to philosophy by not positing an end and then trying to write a script to lead to that ending. And he also reveals repetitions in the history of thought, which makes a lot of sense considering the fact that history repeats itself. Why wouldn't philosophical thought as well?
Yeah.
And so then we turn to Schlegel, who was a very interesting character. I found myself very sympathetic to him.
Wonderful.
Can you talk a bit about who he was and how he comes into this narrative?
Friedrich Schlegel was born in 1772, and he...
Same year as de Gerondeau, that's right. And he died in 1829. It's very hard to summarize his biography because he had, when you discover yourself, that might be like the one time in your life or this 2 times in your life you discover who you really are, right? Well, he continually discovers who he really is. So his evolution as a human mind and a personality is incredible. He can be said to reinvent himself over and over again throughout the course of his life. He begins as a Lutheran, and when he was in his 20s, the French Revolution broke out, and he was pro-revolutionary. And then within 10 years of that, he soured on the revolution and turned towards Catholicism. And he even converted with his Jewish wife to the Catholic religion. And on the heels of that, he becomes a political conservative, and he approaches the Austrian government and is hired by Metternich to become a diplomat and journalist, like propaganda writer, on behalf of the Austrian interests in this period of Napoleon and will Europe go forward, right, represented by the ideals of the French Revolution, or will Europe go backward, represented by Metternich. And Schlegel is politically backward, although he is not, with the exception that he wants Jewish emancipation. He was more than sympathetic to Jewish Europeans, himself being married to one. Right about the time of his conservative turn, he began the study of Persian and Sanskrit, the study of Indian religion and philosophy. He was very passionate about that and spent more than a year daily drilling Sanskrit in Paris. He was also an itinerant lecturer. People would pay to be in the audience for his lectures. These were usually wealthy patrons, and the lectures were privately held. He was also a literary theorist, a novelist. He was also a historian of philosophy. His history of philosophy was delivered in the form of lectures. So what we know about his thought as a historian of philosophy are from these lectures that he gave to a private audience. He calls his lectures 12 books on philosophy, but on review, one will notice that he is doing comparative philosophy. He's writing on philosophy, comparative and historically, right? So comparative history of philosophy. And it's very similar to de Gerondeau. He might have derived the idea from de Gerondeau, or he could have derived the idea from just being in Paris during the time when the comparative method was just a very new and powerful, very admired development in the natural sciences. So comparison as a method could have been something that he learned from, let's say, the French intellectual atmosphere. And that's not very clear because he did not really have a correspondence with de Gerondeau. I found one letter. From Schlegel to de Gerondeau, and it's Schlegel asking de Gerondeau for a payment.